Arizona. To most people, that word paints a picture of blazing deserts, towering cacti, and breathtaking sunsets stretching endlessly across the horizon. But beneath that postcard-perfect surface lies something far darker. Arizona's history is not just about cowboys, saloons, or the romanticized Wild West you've seen in movies. It's a history built on conflict, betrayal, bloodshed, and survival in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. For centuries, this land has been a crossroads where indigenous nations carved out civilizations long before Europeans set foot here, where explorers and settlers clashed with the brutal reality of the desert, and where power was fought over through wars, massacres, and deals that left scars still visible today. Arizona's story is not just about the past. It's about how myths are created, how legends are twisted, and how an entire identity was forged through violence and resilience. And if you think you know Arizona, think again. Because tonight, we're not talking about the Arizona of travel brochures or glossy magazines. We're diving into the hidden history, the origins that reveal a side of this land most people have never dared to confront. The conflict begins with one simple question: who truly owns Arizona? Was it the land of the Hohokam and Ancestral Puebloans, whose irrigation systems turned desert into farmland centuries before Europeans arrived? Was it claimed by the Spanish crown, whose missionaries and conquistadors marched north in search of wealth and souls to convert? Or was it stolen by force when the United States pushed its borders westward, redrawing maps with treaties that few locals ever agreed to? Arizona has always been contested ground. Long before it became the 48th state in 1912, this region was soaked in struggle. The Apaches, the Navajo, the Pima, and countless other indigenous peoples lived here, fought here, and died here. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they didn't discover Arizona, they invaded it. Missions and presidios were built not as places of peace, but as footholds in a war for control of land and identity. Then came Mexico, inheriting Arizona after independence from Spain, but stability never lasted long. The region became a target for raids, revolts, and skirmishes between settlers and tribes. And just when Mexico thought it had a hold on this vast, desolate territory, the United States arrived hungry for expansion, fueled by the doctrine of manifest destiny, willing to use treaties and violence to take what it wanted. This is where Arizona's history becomes more than just dates on a timeline. It becomes a story of survival and betrayal, a story of cultures colliding, of promises broken, of borders shifting like desert sands. And at the center of it all lies a haunting truth. Arizona was never given, it was taken. In this documentary, we are going to peel back the layers of Arizona's history. We'll uncover the ancient civilizations that thrived here long before colonial boots touched the ground. We'll follow the bloody clashes between indigenous tribes and European settlers. We'll step into the violence of the Apache Wars, the cruelty of massacres forgotten in textbooks, and the shadowy deals of the Gadsden Purchase that carved Arizona into the United States map. But we won't stop at the wars and treaties. We'll also explore the mythology, the way Arizona was branded as the Wild West, a land of opportunity and lawlessness, where men like Geronimo became both heroes and villains, depending on who told the story. We'll reveal how Arizona's origins are inseparable from themes of conquest, survival, and resilience, and why its history is far darker than most would ever imagine. By the end of this journey, you'll never look at Arizona the same way again. Because behind the desert beauty and the tourist-friendly tailies lies a history drenched in blood, ambition, and silence. And tonight, we're breaking that silence. Long before Arizona, was Arizona long before borders, treaties, or even the name itself? This land was alive with civilizations that defied the desert. Around 300 AD, The Hohokam people built one of the most advanced irrigation networks in North America. Using nothing but stone tools, they carved canals through the desert floor, bringing life to land most would consider barren. They cultivated corn, beans, cotton, and squash, sustaining entire cities where today only ruins remain. The ancestral Puebloans, often called the Anasazi, built cliff dwellings that rose like fortresses from the rock. Their stone villages clung to canyon walls, overlooking valleys where trade routes once connected them to cultures as far away as Mexico and the Pacific coast. These were not scattered tribes living in isolation. They were architects, farmers, astronomers, and warriors, shaping Arizona's earliest identity. Yet, just as quickly as they flourished, they vanished. By the 5th-10th century, entire settlements were abandoned. Was it drought? War? Disease? Historians still argue, but what remains is a haunting silence. Great civilizations reduced to ruins, whispers of lives erased by forces no one could fully control. And in that silence, peoples emerged: the Apache, the Navajo, the Pima, nations who would carry the legacy of survival forward into the centuries of conflict yet to come. But this thriving native world was about to meet an intruder that would change everything. In 1539, a Franciscan friar named Marcos de Niza entered the territory that would become Arizona. He claimed he had seen the legendary 7 cities of gold Cibol, a promise of endless wealth hidden in the desert. His report sent Spanish conquistadors marching north, led by Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. They expected riches beyond imagination. Instead, they found pueblos of stone and mud, defended by people who had no intention of bowing to an empire. The myth of Cibola was a lie, but the damage was real. Wherever the Spanish went, they carried fire, steel, and disease. They forced conversions, enslaved native peoples, and built missions not as sanctuaries of faith, but as outposts of control. To the indigenous, the arrival of the Spanish was not a discovery, it was an invasion. The desert itself fought back. Soldiers died of thirst and exhaustion. Expeditions collapsed. Yet Spain refused to let go, planting missions and presidios across the region. Conflict boiled. Rebellions flared. And in 1680, the Pueblo Revolt exploded, a violent uprising that expelled Spanish settlers from New Mexico and sent shockwaves through Arizona's frontier. But history shows us that empires rarely retreat for long. The Spanish returned with greater force, and the cycle of conquest and resistance deepened. For Arizona, this was the beginning of a centuries-long struggle, where no empire, no nation, no tribe could hold the land without bloodshed. As Spanish missions spread across Arizona, so did resentment. Indigenous communities who had survived centuries in the desert suddenly faced forced labor, cultural erasure, and violent punishments for resisting conversion. But some would not submit. The Apaches, a fierce and mobile people, became the nightmare of colonial outposts. Masters of guerrilla warfare, they struck from the mountains and vanished into the desert like ghosts, their knowledge of the land giving them an advantage no army could match. Before continuing, if this video is interesting and educational, I ask you to like it and subscribe to the channel. That would help me a lot to continue growing and continue uploading more educational content like this. For centuries, the Apaches waged war, not just against the Spanish, but later against Mexican settlers, and eventually the United States military. This was not a war fought in a single battle. It was a grinding conflict of raids, ambushes, and retaliations that stretched across generations. To Spanish settlers, the Apache were savages. To their own people, they were protectors of land, identity, and freedom. The violence escalated after Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821. Suddenly, Arizona was Mexican territory, But the new government had little control over the vast desert frontier. Settlements remained vulnerable, outposts were isolated, and the Apache took advantage, striking harder and more often, refusing to let another empire dictate their survival. But the darkest chapter was still to come. When the United States arrived in the mid-19th century, a conflict reached its bloodiest peak. The U.S. military, determined to crush resistance, launched campaigns that pushed the Apache to the brink of annihilation. Leaders like Cochise and Geronimo became legends, symbols of defiance who carried their people's fight against impossible odds. The wars were brutal. Entire villages were burned. Families were slaughtered. And yet, the Apache endured, refusing to vanish quietly into history. Their resistance became one of the longest wars in American history, stretching nearly 40 years. By the time the U.S. declared Arizona part of its territory, the ground was already soaked with centuries of conflict. Treaties were signed, then broken. Promises were made, then betrayed. Reservations were established, often in the harshest, least livable areas, cutting tribes off from their ancestral lands. The story of Arizona is a story of betrayal, layered on betrayal. Spain betraying the Pueblos, Mexico betraying its indigenous allies, and the United States betraying the very treaties it wrote. Each empire saw Arizona as empty land to be claimed, while those who had lived here for thousands of years were erased from their own history. But even as violence scarred the desert, a new chapter was beginning. Expansion, commerce, and ambition would soon transform Arizona into a prize one that powerful nations would fight to control. And at the center of it all was a single question: how much blood was Arizona worth? Every war has its generals, but the Apache Wars had something more: men who became legends, whose very names struck fear or admiration, depending on who you asked. Among them, two figures tower above the rest: Cochise and Geronimo. Cochise was born around 1805, a Chiricahua Apache who grew up knowing the desert not as an enemy, but as a home that gave and took with equal brutality. He was tall, imposing, and carried himself with the authority of someone born to lead. To his people, he was a protector, a strategist who defended their lands against endless waves of intruders. To settlers and soldiers, he was a ghostly adversary, vanishing into the mountains after every raid, leaving destruction in his wake. The war that would define his life began in 1861, after an American officer falsely accused Cochise of kidnapping a rancher's child. When Cochise denied the charges, the officer tried to arrest him under a white flag of truce. Betrayal led to bloodshed, and the Bascom Affair, as history remembers it, ignited a fire that burned for over a decade. Cochise retaliated with fury, striking settlements, cutting off supply lines, and refusing every attempt at submission. He fought until his death in 1874, a reminder that the desert could never be tamed without resistance. And then there was Geronimo. If Cochise was the strategist, Geronimo was the embodiment of defiance itself. Born in 1829, Geronimo's life changed forever when Mexican soldiers attacked his camp, killing his wife, children, and mother. From that day forward, Geronimo claimed that visions from a higher power gave him strength and protection. He became a relentless warrior, leading raids that blurred the line between vengeance and survival. His enemies called him ruthless, even savage. But his people saw a man who refused to bow, a leader who carried the pain of personal tragedy into a lifelong war. The U.S. Army, armed with superior weapons and numbers, could never completely break him. Even when hunted across deserts and mountains, Geronimo slipped through their grasp, a living ghost of resistance. But every ghost eventually fades. In 1886, Geronimo finally surrendered after decades of bloodshed. He was shipped far from Arizona, paraded as a curiosity at fairs and expositions. A man once feared, now reduced to a spectacle for crowds. Yet even in defeat, Geronimo remained a symbol, the last breath of a war that had consumed generations. A haunting reminder that Arizona's origins were written in betrayal and broken promises. As Cochise and Geronimo's wars came to an end, another battle was already unfolding, not with weapons, but with treaties and ink. Spain was gone, Mexico was weak, and the United States, driven by its hunger for land and expansion, was ready to redraw the map of the Southwest. The Mexican-American War ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a document that forced Mexico to surrender vast territories, including what would one day become Arizona. But even that wasn't enough. A few years later, the U.S. negotiated the Gadsden Purchase, seizing even more land in exchange for money Mexico desperately needed. In a matter of years, Arizona was transformed. What had once been indigenous land and Spanish territory in Mexican soil was now firmly under the control of the United States. But control on paper did not mean peace in reality. The desert still burned with tension. The scars of centuries of conflict had not healed, and the myths of the Wild West were only beginning to take root. When the ink dried on the Gadsden Purchase in 1854, Arizona was no longer a battlefield between nations. It was now a territory of the United States. Indigenous nations, already decimated by decades of violence, were forced into an existence that was neither free nor respected. Reservations were established in remote corners of the desert, often on land unsuitable for farming or survival. Promises of food, protection, and autonomy were written into treaties, but almost immediately, those promises were broken. Supplies rarely arrived. Corruption ran rampant. Hunger and disease became weapons of control. The U.S. government called it civilizing, but for the Apache, the Navajo, the Pima, and so many others, it was nothing less than cultural death. Children were taken to boarding schools where speaking their own language was punished. Traditions were outlawed. Generations were taught not just to abandon their culture, but to forget it entirely. And yet, despite this machinery of erasure, the resistance never completely died. Small uprisings, hidden ceremonies, and whispered stories kept their identities alive. Even as Arizona's population of settlers grew, the original nations of the land refused to vanish into silence. But while indigenous peoples were being pushed into reservations, Arizona itself was becoming something else entirely, a magnet for fortune seekers, wanderers, and criminals. The discovery of copper and silver veins beneath the desert floor drew miners from across the world. Towns appeared overnight, some thriving for a few short years before collapsing into ghost towns. With wealth came chaos, and with chaos came violence. The law was a fragile thing in Arizona's frontier. Sheriffs and marshals were often outnumbered by bandits and gunslingers. Outlaws like the Clanton, gang and gunfighters like Johnny Ringo, turned the Arizona desert into a stage where greed and survival were settled with bullets. The town of Tombstone became the symbol of this era, a place where gambling, saloons, and shootouts blurred the line between legend and nightmare. And at the center of it all was an event burned into American folklore, the gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881. In just 30 seconds of gunfire, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and a handful of lawmen etched themselves into history, turning a bloody street brawl into one of the most enduring myths of the Wild West. But here's the dark truth. For every gunfight that became a legend, dozens of massacres, lynchings, and acts of violence disappeared from the record. The Wild West was less about heroism and more about survival, where greed carved deeper scars into Arizona's history, and where justice was often nothing more than vengeance dressed in a badge. By the late 19th century, Arizona had been transformed. Mining booms had drawn thousands of settlers. Railroads carved steel lines across the desert, linking once isolated towns to markets in California and the East. The frontier was closing. The violence that had defined Arizona's origins had not disappeared, it had only changed form. Indigenous peoples remained confined to reservations, their numbers reduced, their autonomy stripped. Chinese immigrants who had built the railroads faced brutal discrimination and violence. Mexican communities, once the backbone of Arizona's labor force, found themselves treated as second-class citizens in a land that had only recently been theirs. Arizona was marketed as a land of opportunity, but beneath that image lay a reality of exploitation, racism, and a fragile balance between progress and oppression. And yet, Arizona's leaders wanted more. They wanted legitimacy. They wanted to shake off the image of a lawless frontier and claim their place as part of the United States, not as a territory, but as a state. But statehood would not come easily. For decades, Arizona was seen by Washington as too unstable, too violent, too wild to join the Union. Its reputation as a land of gunfights, rebellions, and unrest haunted its ambitions. To the political elite in the East, Arizona was still the dark frontier, a place of deserts, bandits, and restless tribes. New Mexico and Arizona had once been bound together under the same territorial government, but the people of Arizona wanted independence. They argued they were not like their neighbors, that their land, their people, and their culture deserved recognition on its own. Petitions were sent, proposals were debated, and year after year, Congress hesitated. It wasn't until the dawn of the 20th century, after decades of lobbying and the slow building of infrastructure, that Arizona's dream came within reach. But even then, politics played its hand. President William Howard Taft initially vetoed Arizona's bid for statehood in 1911, ironically, not because of violence, but because of a clause in its constitution allowing judges to be recalled by popular vote. Taft feared it was too radical, too dangerous for the stability of the Union. Arizona refused to give up. The clause was temporarily removed, and finally, on February 14, 1912, Arizona was admitted as the 48th state of the United States, the last of the contiguous states to join the Union. The so-called Wild West had officially been domesticated, but the story doesn't end there. Arizona entered the 20th century, carrying the weight of its past. The mines that had fueled its economy also left behind poisoned lands and broken communities. Indigenous peoples remained trapped in cycles of poverty and dispossession, and the myth of the Wild West, polished by dime novels and Hollywood films, buried the darker truths of massacres, betrayals, and systemic oppression. The Arizona of statehood was celebrated as a triumph of progress, a new member of the Union ready to grow and modernize. But beneath the speeches and ceremonies, the desert kept its secrets. Secrets of bloodshed, conquest, and resistance. Secrets of a land that was never freely given, but always taken. Arizona is a land of contradictions. A desert that should have been empty, but was once home to civilizations more advanced than most can imagine. A place where canals and cliff dwellings whispered of brilliance long before Europeans set foot on the continent. And yet, those civilizations vanished, leaving behind only ruins and mystery. It is a land of conquest, where the Spanish came chasing gold and souls, but found only resistance. A land where Mexico inherited the scars of colonization, only to lose them again through treaties signed in desperation. And a land where the United States planted its flag, not through honor or consent, but through broken promises and endless bloodshed. Arizona was shaped by the defiance of men like Cochise and Geronimo leaders who fought against impossible odds, whose legacies remain both feared and celebrated. It was scarred by betrayals that forced entire peoples into silence, erasing cultures while glorifying myths of cowboys and outlaws. And in the end, it was baptized into statehood not as a triumph of justice, but as the final act in a long play of conquest, politics, and power. Today, Arizona is a state celebrated for its beauty, its deserts, its sunsets. But beneath every cactus, every canyon, and every town lies a darker story. A reminder that history is never as clean as we are taught. It is layered with blood, ambition, and silence. Arizona is not just a state, it is a story written in shadows. And now I want to ask you, do you think Arizona's history has been told honestly? Or has the myth of the Wild West buried the truth? What do you believe is the darkest chapter in Arizona's past, the fall of its ancient civilizations, the Apache Wars, or the betrayals of statehood? If this journey into Arizona's hidden history made you see this land differently, make sure to subscribe for more stories that pull back the curtain on the darker side of history. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them, and I want to know what you think. Because this story isn't over. And history especially, the dark kind, always has more to reveal.